Yeah. Okay.
I could, I can try.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I, Council President Walsh, call the March 10th Committee of the Whole meeting to order at 6:30 p.m. As a reminder, we continue to have a remote aspect to our meetings, and both staff and members of the public may be participating tonight remotely via WebEx. There are going to be multiple public comment opportunities at tonight's meeting. There's a general public comment opportunity at the beginning of the meeting, or you can make comments after the presentation and council question and answer period on tonight's agenda items. I guess I will ask before I make this, is there anyone online?
We have no virtual attendees, Council President.
Okay, and there are no attendees in audience, so I will just say we welcome your comments. If you're willing to read our packet, go for it. Or if you just have a thought in your head that you want to express to us, citycouncil@issaquah.gov. Okay, looking on to our agenda. We've got two agenda items, COM 0100, Light Rail Station Area Vision and Guiding Principles, and COM 0106, Utility Rate Study, Introduction and Revenue Requirements. So we'll start with the Light Rail Station Area Vision and Guiding Principles with Thomas Feldries, Senior Transportation Planner.
Thank you, Council President. I appreciate the time tonight. And again, my name is Thomas Feldries, Senior Transportation Planner. Tonight I will be bringing this back to the committee, hoping to get your direction on the Central Issaquah Vision and Guiding Principles that I brought in January. So same questions, hoping to get your feedback to understand if you support the vision and guiding principles as presented, which were developed through community engagement efforts from September of 2023 to date. And if there's any other changes you'd like to see, I would appreciate your feedback on that. So again, this is a little bit of review. I did present this in January, but we are expecting lots of growth in Central Issaquah. The majority of the growth that the community will be getting in the next 25 years will be in Central Issaquah, and specifically in the green area, which is the Regional Growth Center. So in 2016, voters approved the Sound Transit 3 ballot measure. This is a light rail extension project that will expand high-capacity transit throughout the region, including the South Kirkland to Issaquah line. So we are expecting one light rail station. It'll be at the end of the line, and that link line will connect through Bellevue and up to South Kirkland. So this is particularly important because we are expecting a significant amount of growth in Central Issaquah, and so this growth will be supported directly by light rail and vice versa. So just to clarify a little bit about the roles of Sound Transit in this project. So this Ski Link project is a Sound Transit project. So just wanted to be clear on that. They will be designing, planning it, they're going to build it, and then ultimately they will manage the operations. So in terms of who makes decisions on this, they will be making the decision, Sound Transit Board specifically, will be making the decision on where the station will go in Central Issaquah, where that track alignment will be. And this is really going to be in alignment with regional priorities. So Sound Transit is interested in how this affects the region in terms of growth, in terms of operations for them. And so us as a city, our goal is to really infuse the local vision, the local priorities into this equation. So the vision and guiding principles are the direct sort of memorialization of what the community is hoping for. So again, Sound Transit will be making final decisions, but we do have some pretty significant tools that can help us really steer the conversation. Specifically, we're looking at zoning and land use, as well as permitting. And so when we talk about zoning and land use, we're really talking about ways that we can support transit operations from like a densities of jobs and housings perspective, as well as the amenities that are going to support a successful light rail station. So, locating the station near an area where we've specifically outlined where we want transit-oriented development to happen, and this can be through an overlay, for example. So if Sound Transit is, to put a light rail station outside of where we've identified lots of densities and, the ability to really build out an area that would support their station, if they were to locate it outside of that area, that would sort of change their equation. It wouldn't be as much of a benefit for them. So in my mind, I'm kind of thinking about this as like the carrot sort of situation. So land use and zoning is the carrot for them, and then the stick is our permitting. So we do have the ability to say, you can't build this here, and that's through permitting. So, as we go through the process with Sound Transit, we do have a conditional use process where we can require and ultimately negotiate some community benefits. So these are sort of the levers that we have. As it stands currently, light rail service is not an allowed use in Central Issaquah. It's not allowed anywhere in the city. So this is something we're going to need to change. And being strategic, we'd want to put it in an area that we would want it to be. So again, Exhibit C is the draft vision and guiding principles. It's been updated since you've last seen it. Oops. Excuse me, I went way far into the slide deck. So just starting with the vision statement, this has been updated, and as it stands, here's what it says. So by 2044, the Central Issaquah station area will be a vibrant, well-connected hub where people of all ages and abilities can easily live, work, and thrive. Designed for walkability and sustainability, it will offer eco-friendly transportation, diverse housing and businesses, and safe, welcoming, and inclusive public spaces. The next three guiding principles are there for really just supporting the vision statement that we have. So the first one is about accessibility and connectivity. Essentially, we're saying that this area is going to be a regional transportation hub. It's located near major destinations. It's going to prioritize easy walking, biking, and transit access. And the parking resources that we do locate here should be thoughtfully placed in order to support and not reduce walkability. The next guiding principle is uses and experiences. This talks about having a balanced mix of homes, businesses, and recreational opportunities. This community hub has essential services and amenities that make daily life easy and convenient. And also, we want to incorporate sustainable design and low impact development, so it really does sort of promote sustainability from a neighborhood level. The last guiding principle is community connections and values. This talks about the station being reflective of Issaquah's values, our heritage, and the natural beauty that people come to seek. It's designed and it's adaptable to changing needs, and it fosters strong social connections. The station area is well maintained. It's a safe, inclusive, and welcoming space. Generally, it brings people together and enhances quality of life. And as an urban center, it reflects Issaquah's desire to both support growth, but also the existing community goals as well. So just to talk about how this vision and guiding principles will be used. So it will be used by us, the city. It will also be used by Sound Transit. So for the city, this is really saying, okay, this is what the community wants out of this whole thing. It'll help us advocate for community desires with Sound Transit, and it provides a framework for the things I've talked about previously. So any zoning and land use changes we want to make, to support where we would prefer the station to go and sort of the densities and uses that would be allowed. It also supports future investments. So this council is aware of the I-90 crossings as an example. That's directly supporting, connecting the north and south side of central Issaquah. That could be helpful. And most importantly, for me, as I am project managing a project, we are looking to develop a locally preferred alternative for the central Issaquah station. Hoping to kick that off in April, but sort of the main deliverable of that would be developing that locally preferred alternative, and this vision would be fed into that as we develop specific criteria for looking at those alternatives. Looking at how Sound Transit will use this, Sound Transit, ultimately, they're going to try to find a project that's going to meet everybody's needs. Their goal is to meet regional needs, but specifying what we're hoping to get out of it will really nix a lot of the options that they may provide just in advance. So knowing where we stand will help them have better alternatives that they will put through their own process. And the goal would be to satisfy all needs, and this will help us find some win-win solutions. So some of the key challenges that I've mentioned before, we are trying to have a walkable station area, but we also acknowledge that because we are an end-of-the-line station, folks from outside the community will be likely wanting to access the station. So balancing the need for walkability from like the neighborhood level, but also acknowledging that folks from outside, out east, to the north and south may be wanting to use our station. We do acknowledge that this once in a lifetime infusion of capital and investment into the community will spur economic growth. But we also acknowledge that that can cause an affordability issue. So there's some strategies that cities have done to address that. We'd like to also take that similar approach and sort of learn from what other cities have done in this area. There's going to be some growing pains, as we look long term where we want to go. Versus how Central Issaquah develops over that time. So we're going to want to acknowledge that there are some challenges with that. And again, navigating control over Sound Transit's process. We do have limited control, but we do have some pretty useful measures. And it's all about knowing the tools that you have and using them effectively and timely. So again, these are the strategies that we have. We've been learning from peer cities that have gone through this process. We've got many strategies that we think can be tailored to our own situation. So council did provide feedback on this in January. I really appreciated it. Since then, we have a new council member, so I'm really excited to hear more feedback. But at that point in January, I did seek to address some of the comments we got. So, making the document more plain-spoken, balancing the need for technical terms was another comment. We've attempted to do this throughout the document, have added footnotes where needed, and trimmed out some of the jargon. Provided additional guidance for the path forward. So we provided some strategies for the challenges that we're expecting that we think will be very useful as those challenges arise. We also simplified the vision statement and made the guiding principles more accessible and understandable. So again, here's a summary of changes. I will also note we also developed a executive summary, which I think might be helpful as well, just to add to the public accessibility component. But yeah, this is a summary of changes that were made. Again, there's no financial cost or immediate regulatory impacts at this time, but we are formalizing the community's vision, providing guidance for future decisions, supporting future policy development, and aiding our ability to collaborate with Sound Transit. So I will pause here and would appreciate any feedback you have. Thank you.
Great.
Council President?
Yes.
Just to let you know, Councilmember Joe is now joining the meeting.
Oh,
and is
fantastic.
joining us via phone.
Fantastic. Okay, so Russell, Councilmember Joe, we will look for any questions from you at this time. We are on the light rail items. So if you have any questions there, I'll start with you. Otherwise, I'll go to the other council members. Not hearing any. Nope. Councilmember Joe, any?
Hi, Nell, thank you.
Not now. Okay, fantastic. Then I will look through, starting with Councilmember Ray.
I just had a couple of questions for you, Thomas. And you talked about, and maybe we've talked about this before, but I'm doing it again. We talked about zoning and permitting as tools that we have in our toolbox. Is that both for right-of-way and tracks or stations or both?
It would be both. So like, excuse me. Yeah, so the alignment of the station is a use if it goes through like our property. It's assumed that much of the alignment is going to follow I-90 up until Issaquah, and then it could deviate or not. So if it does go into land that is within our purview, that would be like a zoning and like
Okay.
land use
Great.
component.
And then what do you see, once we put a bow on this, what do you see as the most likely short-term uses of these guiding principles? Is it something we're working on now that'll help, or is it more down the road?
Yeah, it's going to be very useful as soon as we adopt it. We're going to use it directly in the light rail planning guide. That's going to be translated into specific evaluation criteria. That's also going to go to council, I believe, later in the year. So it'll be directly used, as soon as we're done with it. It's going to be used for different policy decisions we're going to have to make. It'll be used for a very long time.
And last question, I promise. So you talked about how other communities are dealing with the affordability issues that arise from having this economic boom come to town. But it made me think about, what about public safety, both from a police and a fire/EMS perspective? Have you had any insights, speaking right on cue, any insights into how other communities have dealt with that and the impacts that we might expect?
Yeah, it's a great question. With development, there are requirements to pay into, fire, EMS, policing. So that certainly helps with that equation. Other communities, end of the line, have experienced like very specific issues that other communities that are like sort of pass through would not. So I don't have a great answer for you, but this is something that's definitely on our radar, and we will want to incorporate.
Yeah, I just keep it on the radar, because I think when you have that kind of economic boom and the density, and there's just the potential for some unintended consequences there relative to public safety. So, thank you.
Councilmember Zhang?
Yeah, thanks for putting this together. I know this is kind of, the end of a very long process, and I've come in basically just at the end. So I have a few questions. First, I'm curious how the principles will be used for public engagement. I know there's already been a lot of public engagement, but, as this development goes on, how's that going to happen?
Public engagement is going to be ongoing for, we developed the light rail planning guide, which develops several actions that we'll be taking, especially in the near term, but also like sort of down the road. So this vision and guiding principles will be our North Star that will steer a lot of future conversations. So speaking specifically to the light rail study that we're doing, there's going to be a very extensive engagement process that we're going to do in-house. This is going to be sort of one of the cornerstones of just starting discussions from here, acknowledging that we've spent, 2 years working on this thing, and we want to build off of that and really drill into what the station area might, like where that station could go, how that alignment might fit in with what we've already established as like the priorities for the community.
Yeah, great. And then is this just for questions, or can I make comments as well?
We usually start with questions, and then we go to public comment, and then we'll get a round of feedback.
Okay, cool. That's it then.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I will ask mine. Mentioning the use of zoning and land use as a way to perhaps guide a station area, the areas between the freeway, is that something where if they wanted to locate a station there, that's already their land and we don't have control over that? Or is that not true?
So I'll say, yeah, the freeway has the right-of-way for WashDOT, which is a separate agency who's going to be part of our
yeah.
conversations. They're going to be, we're going to develop like a public agency sort of working group to deal with this. So to answer your question, we're interested in like we can think of it as like the quarter-mile to a half-mile buffer of where that station might be. And that's sort of where most people or most businesses might benefit from access. So,
So the point that I'm trying to get at is, do we have a risk if we make the like the zoned area where they could put a station within the city too difficult that they might choose to put it in between the freeway area as, like, is there any impact that we have on that not being the station location?
I think the impact would be like, yeah, like if you were to be too narrow in your, we'll call it a transit overlay zone, if you were to be too narrow, that would really restrict options. So as we get to that point, as we're thinking about, zoning changes, yeah, we would want to sort of consider that impact and acknowledging that the station area is going to need a certain amount of space and like there's like operational components for King County Metro to like sort of provide service. We will want to think about all those options. I specifically about like the right-of-way section for WashDOT, I think some of that sort of accessory use would probably not be in that right-of-way, and that's sort of where that would come into play if it were like north or south of that.
Okay. So then if I'm thinking through as we go about this process, if at a certain point we're looking at those potential station areas, and one of them is in the center of the freeway right away and others are in other locations, and we develop a preference that it not be in the center of the freeway right away, are there ways that we can discourage or make that zoning not possible?
I think the answer is yes, but Stephen Padua, our planning manager, is on the line, and I bet you he has a more complete and better answer than that. So I'll let Stephen take the question.
Yes, thank you. Council President Walsh, if I could just add on to Thomas's response. It is perfectly within Sound Transit's right to build within the WashDOT right-of-way, but they'll still need access to the site, which is going to be going from outside WashDOT right-of-way. And so regulations from the city are still always going to be apply because they'll still need transit access to the site. They'll still need vehicle access. They'll still need pedestrian and bicycle access. And so outside of WashDOT right-of-way, we'll still be wanting to work with Sound Transit and on what'll be going on site and on the transit-oriented development that'll be supporting the light rail station as well. And so that's where a lot of our influence and our discussions on what the city needs will be able to strongly influence some of the Sound Transit's decision-making for a station area and alignment.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out if there needs to be any adjustments to the tools and the way that we talk about it at this point, because obviously we can't make a decision now whether we want it there or not, but I don't want to get too far down the road and not have that be in our visioning if that is a strong principle. So, okay. Any council member Martz?
So, so the visioning guiding principles is attachment F, located on page 337 of our packet, right? We're not this evening going through line by line that document, is there a point where a committee, a council committee will be going through line by line, or we as a group will be going through line by line? I see lots of red ink and revisions, and these are the sorts of things that we historically have gotten into the details on, but that's not really the way you're presenting it this evening. So how is it envisioned that we will provide feedback on this on this ongoing vision and guiding principles document?
Yeah, it's envisioned that, if you had any feedback, I also have, I think, a clean version in attachment C or exhibit C. If you had any, line by line revisions, happy to receive that. Yeah, any general revisions is fine as well. Yeah, happy to get any feedback you had on the
And,
document.
I mean, I see that it comes to adoption by the council in Q2 of 2025. Is that when you want the feedback, or is tonight supposed to be, I'm just used to seeing documents like these go to a committee, and then that committee reviews them in detail, and you do things, this is where I miss Councilmember Hunt and her verb tenses, and also Councilmember Goodman, and that level of detail that we used to do on documents like this, not like, hey, here's a 300-page document, any questions?
Yeah.
And Council President, members of the council, this has been to the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee a couple different times. Based on the council's budget discussions, we've wanted to bring these final pieces to the committee of the whole because of its urgency and importance to the community. So after tonight, assuming we move forward, we will, I think, mix it up. I think you're going to be hearing a lot about this. You're going to be hearing about it at Mobility and Infrastructure. You're going to be hearing about it at Committee of the Whole. When it's appropriate for the council to take full action, you're going to be hearing about it in different ways. I don't think, under the way the council currently operates, the council wants to go through line by line at a Committee of the Whole. And so the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee for this topic will continue that. But you will see this more often than here at the Committee of the Whole, because I think one of the things the administration came away from the budget process is we have not done a good enough job of keeping the full council apprised of all the good work. I think Mobility and Infrastructure has heard a lot over the last 12, 18 months, but the full council hasn't. So the answer is you're going to have multiple opportunities for many years to come. Tonight is just one piece of this as we move forward.
Thank you.
Councilmember Ray?
Not so much a question, absolutely not a question, but a clarification from Mobility and Infrastructure, so we did review this document and made changes to it. And some of them were specific, and many of them were more directional, like clean this up and make it less techno-speak. But also it went through, I know it went through the Transportation Advisory Board, and I believe it went through the Equity Board also, and they also had a crack at some of the crafting of which you are speaking. So, is it perfect? I don't know. Has it been reviewed? Absolutely.
Great. Any other questions? Yes?
I'll ask you a follow-up then. So, I mean, did Mobility and Infrastructure have were there difficult things where you felt like, boy, we need to bring these back and have some tough conversations? I mean, I personally have had questions about potential parking at the end of these lines, right? And I imagine that that's come up to some extent. But were there issues that you think that down the road are going to require the seven to sharpen their pencil?
I appreciate the question a lot. Yeah, there are going to be some additional clarifications required because it's a guiding principles document, and we tried to capture things that could. That's why I asked the question of when do you expect to be using this, because it's how soon do we need to get this. If there's any other clarifications or whatever we want to put in, how soon is it going to be turned into a actively used document? It sounds like it's imminent. I think that this is, for a vision guiding principle, I think it accomplishes its goal. Is it an implementation plan? Absolutely not. It was not intended to be. So, I think when we talk about what it is and what it isn't, it's like, is it sufficiently robust to meet its purpose? I think so. If there are other points of view, I'm open to those, but I think it gives us an opportunity to say, yes, the city staff is headed in the right direction, and has a frame within which to move forward to activate and actualize what we'd like to see from Sound Transit.
Councilmember Hall?
Well, and I'll just also say too, for council's peace of mind, these are like important questions that were captured kind of in a vague way in terms of guiding principles, but some of the sharpened pencil, more specific questions that you're asking are actually near-term or long-term actions in our planning guide. So those are things that will come back to us. This is just but one of many, right, actions that are outlined in our light rail planning guide. So, and I think is this our third touch now as a council? So one with M&I, committee of the whole, and then back, and then I think it's like 17 pages total for the guiding principles, right? And then the rest of it's like the big, great community outreach that you've done and kind of capturing all of that feedback. So thank you again for that. But just to clarify that.
Councilmember Martz?
So I will ask a high-level question of you and of this document. Do we talk about in it our expectation of how traffic or how commuters from further east than Issaquah will interact with this transit station vis-a-vis parking and buses and all those sorts of things? Do we set out a vision for how we believe that station should work for King County folks east of us?
Let's maybe see, Thomas, do you want to talk about how this point talks to those ideas?
Yeah, I think as written, this vision is more focused on Issaquah folks. In order to accommodate commuters from out east, north, and south, we would rely on the parking discussion that we have for accessibility and connectivity for that guiding principle. We talk about the need to balance parking reserves with the neighborhood being walkable.
Okay, but I bring up this one in particular because if the vision is that Sound Transit is going to serve those folks with buses, then the station would need to have a larger number of bus bays, right? Than if the vision is, and you know where my concern comes from, right? It's MARTA and the 2,000 stall parking garages that are at the end of every single MARTA line, right? So if we have a vision for how we believe this station, we have to talk about how the station will work within Sound Transit as a whole, not merely for what we hope to get out of the station, right? And this issue of how we deal with commuters east of us, like I said, it has ramifications on the obvious parking stalls, but also the example that I used, bus bays.
So I'm wondering, it sounds like there might be some discussion here that maybe we take this to the discussion portion.
I don't think it's keyed up for that discussion. I think I gave an example of something that at some point before this document is formally adopted, it seems like the kind of question we'd want to address. I don't believe things are teed up to have that conversation this evening.
So I think there are items in the document that I would want to bring up that speak to those ideas, but I kind of want to make sure that we're in the right standpoint so that we can do a lot of back and forth when typically questions are to staff and such. But are you saying you're asking the question because you don't think that's there?
I suspect that there are policy level things around this visioning and guiding principles that need to be hashed out at the level of 7. And it doesn't sound like we're going to have that conversation this evening, but we need to have them before we adopt this.
Great. Then let's definitely have that conversation because I do want to talk that through in feedback. So any other questions? No? Okay. Let me just check in, see if we have any members of the public online.
Council President, we do not.
Okay. So then going back into comments, I know Councilmember Jang had a bunch of ideas presented there, but maybe we start talking about parking and all of that, and how it relates to a visioning document. So I'll start with Deputy Council President DeMichelle.
Okay, if it's all right, I'll get to that question in just a second. I just had some general remarks to start off with. My feedback was, first of all, it's a much more easily read document. I really appreciated that. That was one of the things that the Mobility and Infrastructure asked for, was that the readability be really for the general public, so we can use this in future public engagement. I think, reading through the vision and then the principles, I thought they were very Issaquah-y. In other words, they really reflect a lot of other outreach that we've done and the kind of things that the people in our community are very interested in. Green spaces and all of those really nice visions. I did notice, I read through all of the public comments that we received and that you received in your outreach, and I did notice that the highest priority was safety and security and comfort in the station. And so, and I also noticed there were quite a few comments that said they wanted a public space, and we do lack public spaces in Issaquah. So it's very interesting that if you combine those two, safety and then a place where people can feel comfortable hanging out, those two kind of go together. So there are some nice thoughts in there about how this could look and feel in our community. We did get comments about trade-offs, not only here tonight, but also we got communications, email communications about that. And one of the things that I thought was in the comments that we received, but not maybe so much reflected in the final document, was this tension between how are we going to preserve the nature and the character of the community. We have this multi-million-dollar, very modern facility that's going to go in, and we have the interest in maintaining our history and the character and the look and feel of Issaquah. So I think that's going to be one of the trade-offs that we're going to be talking about as we go down the road. I think we're not ready for the discussion on parking and access tonight, because this is an overall umbrella type of document that will help us narrow in on those things. And so we can, I don't mind if we talk about parking, but I just don't think we're ready there. This is a really high level document, and to have those other discussions, I think we don't have the information that we could use to really have those, but we can have that discussion. So overall, I think it's a very good document. It's very aspirational. It's like pie in the sky. It really is this amazing document. We want everything to be beautiful, but we want it to fit into Old Town and da-da-da-da-da. So there's obviously going to be some things that are going to emerge as more important or more practical or less costly that will, as we walk down that trail, will come out and emerge. But I think it's very good to start with an aspirational document that really outlines this will be our dream, and when reality sets in, we'll have to trim it just a bit. So I think good job. Thank you so much.
Councilmember Zhang?
Thank you. So to Councilmember Mart's point about who's the one going line by line, that's like my hobby, nitpicking language, so don't you worry. And I think overall, I appreciate that it seems like it's gotten a lot more plain spoken and better. However, I still do think that the principles themselves are kind of like awkward to read. Like a lot of the sentences are like you're trying to, put different concepts together into the same sentence. And so that's a bit challenging for me, just from, the guiding principles perspective. I think to Councilmember Mart's point about the bus connectivity as well, I think that definitely should be something that we highlight at the principles level under accessibility and connectivity. For example, it says designed for easy walking, biking, and public transit. Okay, well, public transit, it's light rail, so does that mean that we're good to go on the public transit? Or does it also need to be connected to, local circulator buses or, buses from, let's say, North Bend or Snoqualmie, farther east? So I think that should be something that we could move up to the principles level in terms of just big picture what we want to do. And I had other comments that I said in an email, for example, like uses and experiences to me doesn't seem like a principle in and of itself, maybe like diverse or varied uses and experiences. And yeah, I think just generally, I really did like the the specific actions. They were very clear. And whereas I think the principles themselves, when there's like a big paragraph, it is a bit harder to read, and maybe bullet pointing it out could make it easier. So.
Councilmember Hall, do you have yours up, down? Councilmember Ray?
I'm going to kind of pile on where our Deputy Council President Dee Michelle was going. And this may be a discussion around document purpose that we might want to be more clear on. What's the difference between guiding principles and an implementation plan? And I think, and so I'm looking through this from a specific lens, and I think others may be looking at it from a different lens. So the fact that we're seeing different things is probably not too surprising. I think the parking discussion is premature. I think that's going to be completely dictated by where Sound Transit wants to go. As much as we like to push them or influence their direction, they are ultimately going to decide what the service model is going to look like, whether or not there's going to be feeder buses, whether or not there's going to be not feeder buses, and we're going to have a lot of bike racks. That's up to them. I think that's their discussion or their choice that we can influence. So I think that the document for me helps us to get our heads aligned to what I think are the principles. So when conversations start to come up with our partners, be it WashDOT or be it Sound Transit or be it King County, that we're in a position to say, we've already thought this one through from a high-level perspective, and we have a thoughtful way to respond to various proposals. So yes, I agree with much that I've heard from everybody, but I think from my understanding of the purpose of the document, it seems to work well for me. So I'll just leave it there, and I'm looking forward to what Councilmember Martz has to say.
Councilmember Martz.
So I agree that this is not the time to say that we need 427 parking spaces, not 428 parking spaces. This document has some of the kinds of details that I think are important in a vision statement. I love the nod to distributed parking strategy, right? Saying that an example of a level of detail that I think should be at the vision statement is we have a brilliant transit center and we have a brilliant park and ride. And this new facility should take advantage of that and should have facilities that incorporate using that. That is a bit us telling Sound Transit how to do its job and Metro how to do their job, but that's part of our job, right? We're trying to tell them what this facility should look like in our community, and it'll involve providing them some feedback. So that is a level of detail that I think is appropriate in this document. And so to have that, I think we should also have a level of detail that says, what do we think is going to happen given that we're the last station on the line, right? Do we think there's any chance they'll extend the line out to North Bend or not? And if not, how do we think that's going to work? I think that is the same way, that to me is the same level of detail and appropriate for this document as the discussion on distributed parking strategy. The only difference is distributed parking strategy is it's sort of putting a fence around it and saying we're just talking about things that are in the city. But I think being the last station on the line, we have to talk about the folks who live to the east of us. There are more of whom every year. And I want to make sure that when this gets built, that our friends and neighbors in Snoqualmie and North Bend, that this is something that helps make their lives easier too, right? They're going to want to be in on it. And some of them pay transit fees the way we do. And so they get to, we want to have a system that works well for them as well. Thank you.
I'll go ahead and go then. I appreciate what Councilmember Martz has said there. I do think this document has gotten into some of the details around and presents a theory of how we want to build and how we want to create around the distributed parking strategy, and also features, things about balancing walkability with vehicle-oriented infrastructure and things like that. I think recognizing that this will likely be a bus connectivity place and that we are going to have to navigate that as a component of also having a walkable station area that creates a, livable, lively area, I think is important because it's going to be a portion of a potential conflict. If a lot of the base floor area isn't just the light rail, and station area, but also bus transit connectivity. That's an important element of understanding what the conflicts and the design capabilities will be. I think similarly, I could see conflicts around this being an end-of-line station that has the maintenance facilities and how we are able to navigate that as an idea with these concepts of walkability, bus connectivity, number of parking, ideas. So I do think there are some ideas there, whether those need to be in this document or represented in another way, but they do seem to be potential conflicts, which is a lot of what I see in this document in this area. So, Councilmember Hall, haven't heard from you yet. Anything?
The most important thing from my perspective is just to start using it. I agree with Councilmember Ray. I think this fits all of the uses that it's needed as a tool. Some of these other questions are very detailed and addressed in the planning guide as things that we'll get to. This is a high level just visioning tool that primarily the users are our staff in terms of how they interact with sound transit and how us as council think about the different policy changes that we need to make. We're going to go back to this document and say, oh, okay, it does say that it should be designed for easy walking, biking, and public transit. Or, okay, it does say that. Okay, so now what do we take from that into policy? So I think in terms of what this document needs to be, it fits the bill exactly right. And the most important thing is just to start using it as the tool that it is. But if there are changes that you're hearing that are sounding simple, everything that we're talking about sounds within the exact same ethos that exists already in the report. So if there are changes that better capture kind of what you're hearing up here, I'm supportive of that too.
I will just make a comment that the folks who were in mobility and infrastructure seem to have a clearer understanding and sense of it, and others are maybe feeling a little bit of discomfort in wanting to make sure that, because when I'm reading over this, I definitely pulled out the distributed parking strategy, but didn't necessarily see a vision of, oh, this is, going to be walkable versus car. Like, I still feel some conflicts there. So I'll at least put that out. Deputy Council President.
Yeah, just real quickly, to me, reading through the comments was really the most helpful thing because it is a high-level document and a high-level vision. And then you read through the comments that we received and you see the nuance that is around a lot of the concepts that they tried to capture in a sentence or two. And we had over 800 people participate, right? So we have pages and pages and pages of commentary. And reading through those commentaries, you really get a feel for exactly what that high-level language is referring to. I think conflict is almost inherent in it and identifies in some ways. We heard from through email from someone who thought that we hadn't identified the trade-offs, and I thought, yeah, we identified them really well. The conflicts are very clear where we've got this value, and the community likes both of those values. But in the process of planning this, we're going to have to hone those and figure out where we can find compromise and where it's going to be impossible to find compromise. And then at that point, we'll have to trade off some things. So I think overall it's done a good job of surfacing the things, and especially the community engagement part of it, surfaced those conflicts, those possible areas where we're going to need to do trade-offs. So, thank you.
Maybe I'm gonna see if Councilmember Joe has any comments. We'll see about unmuting you from our side. Councilmember Joe.
Thank you. Yeah, a great discussion that I've been listening to. I appreciate the staff putting this together and making some of the changes that we had talked about at the last meeting. I will be new to the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee this year, so I appreciate that we have Councilmember Ray as a carryover with some of the institutional knowledge. We'll certainly listen to the comments and try to make sure that we're incorporating the comments in there, particularly as we look toward parking access and how walkable the sound center transit will be for us as well. I think that I would agree with the general comments. So this is a visionary document to give us guidance at this point, but I appreciate that everyone on the council seems to be pressing to try to make this the best product possible for our citizens. And I think that if we continue down that track, we're going to potentially get something that will work for our citizens and will be a good asset. So great discussions tonight. Appreciate all the hard work, and that's all I have right now.
Thank you, Councilmember Joe. Going back to Councilmember Zhang.
Yeah, one other thing that I wanted to surface, going off both Councilmembers Mart's comments on, MARTA, which I believe is in Atlanta, as well as one of the emails we received from the public about, we should look at all the examples highlighted in here. It's like Redmond, Federal Way, other station in Redmond, Kirkland, and I think we should, potentially broaden our horizons beyond that and see, hey, what are some other end-of-the-line stations out there in the world that work well, or actually that don't work well? Like, are we open to doing some case studies that didn't work well so we can avoid replicating their mistakes? Because I think just looking at what went well and trying to replicate that, then I think the more important thing is, like, what should we avoid that went really badly? Yeah, that was it.
Okay, so where are we sitting? We've heard a little bit of conflict, ultimately maybe enough to move forward with this. Any thoughts? Councilmember Hull.
I was just going to say I'm not necessarily hearing any conflict unless you are, staff. Are you hearing anything that you wouldn't necessarily want to update in here? I haven't heard anything necessarily.
Councilmember Hall, members of the council, I think there's been a couple themes here. One has been you want to make sure this is as valuable a document as possible and as clear and concise as possible. And we've heard from a few of you this evening some suggestions on some language. If the council would like us to make one last pass, leaving the concepts as is and see what we could do, wordsmithing a little bit, we're happy to do that at your direction. So I think that's the first question, or if you feel that the language that's there is sufficient and we can move forward. The second piece has been the discussion regarding parking. I think you've heard from members of the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee and from staff a little bit, and Andrea Snyder is also on the line, and if you'd like to hear from her as well. This tension between, high-level, big-picture direction and how we move forward. If the council feels that this end-of-the-line parking issue is, so critical, I think we'd like to hear that tonight from you, because then it may be necessary to make a change. We're trying, as your staff, to be honest actors here, in that you gave us direction to reach out to the community. We reached out to the community, and what you see in these documents does reflect concern about this sort of interoperability, not only from cars, but buses, all of the tensions. We feel we've covered that. However, you are the policymakers. If you as a body feel it still needs to be hit a little harder, at this point, we're happy to do that as well at your direction. Our administration's feeling is that we've got it covered in the language that exists, knowing that there's so much more to come. And we want to be respectful to the things that the community and our boards and commissions highlighted, because they spent the better part of a year working on this document as well. So I think, Council President, those are the two questions. One is additional wordsmithing requested to make it even more clear the concepts that are there. And then secondly, does the council wish any other changes regarding the end of the line parking?
Okay, Councilmember Ray?
City Administrator, thanks for teeing that up. I think that there's a question here that wraps around this notion of parking versus additional feeder buses versus whatever is that vehicle. And I would like, as we go through this final cut at vision or guiding principles, if we can tease that back to the principle, which is something along the lines of the design incorporates the needs of people in Issaquah as well as the surrounding community. And looking for wordsmith here, but that's horrible wording. But what I want to capture is what Councilmember Martz alluded to, which is this isn't just our toy to play with. It's a regional toy. We're end of line. That's special to be the end of the line. And we need to have some principles that talk about how we show up, not just for Issaquah, but for those outside of Issaquah that will be using the Issaquah station.
So I will note there is a point in there. It says the station area must find the right balance between different priorities, such as serving local community members while also meeting regional commuter needs as an end-of-the-line station without increasing traffic problems. So I think there is some that is in there, but perhaps what I might offer is just a little bit more on the fact that we're an end-of-the-line station, and we'll have to navigate that as a particular. And perhaps that satisfies the concepts here, given that we probably won't have all that much control over parking choices because it's Sound Transit. But Councilmember Martz.
We won't have much control over parking options because it's Sound Transit.
Because it's their budget.
Wasn't this the conversation that I've brought up like 3 times in the last 6 months, and I keep getting reassured that by us saying what we want, we will have some control over the parking situation? I mean, the lowest cost option will be to put a gigantic parking lot in the heart of our city. That's how Atlanta did it. That's the lowest cost option. We're dancing around the issue, which is we all believe that the transit station here should have feeder buses that come in from the east, that it shouldn't be cars that all come in because we won't have the capacity for it. And I think if that's what we believe and that's the vision and that's what we think is best for our planet and for our community, we should say so. And if we don't have any control over how much parking goes into this station, then I'm fundamentally opposed to this station. We do not need multi-thousand station parking lots in our city, and it would be bad for our city, and we should help Sound Transit get to a place where they build their public transportation options out to North Bend and Snoqualmie, such that, because we know that's better for both our community and for the planet. Thank you.
I will clarify that what I meant was I don't think we would be able to get Sound Transit to increase beyond what ST3 was allocated, was what I meant out of that. Deputy Council President DiMichele.
So when we were working on the light rail guide, I believe we had commentary at that point about the placement, which this is not the decision tonight about placement, but that the placement of the station should be amenable to Sound Transit expansion out to further into far East King County, so that, the fact that we are end of the line, we might not be end of the line 20, 30, 40 years after 2042. We are talking really long range at this point. So I think that concept is out there, but that really is a placement issue, not what is this going to look like issue. And So there are so many options out there still about where this could be placed. It could be placed further down I-90, there are lots of issues about where it could be placed. And then, or just a reminder that the city does have the zoning and the permit, power to say, no, we can't do that. So we can't put this in downtown Issaquah, for example. So I think that we shouldn't conflate the decision about where this station is going to go with how it's going to look or the elements of design that we want in it and so forth, which is what this document is about. So that's my comments.
Okay, I think we have all created a lot of feedback. Is this something then that you are ready to take forward?
So based on the council's discussion this evening, what we will bring back, and again, we've got 400 pages in this, we're not going to repeat that. When you get this back for action at a full council meeting, which I think April 7th is the date we're looking at, you will have one document, and that will be the document you're asking approval on. We will take all the comments on clarity and issues related to that, and we'll do one last scrub. The administration's feeling is that, the parking language is sufficient. We'll review the tape from tonight. We'll look at the language, and if it makes sense to tweak something here or there, which we feel more finely gives the council's direction on this, we will do that and present it back to you for final approval.
I would just highlight, I think there was more conversation about end of the line and how that is special than specifically parking, would just be my ask.
Okay, and so like I said, we will carefully review the tape and, but come back to you with one document, which will be what, 20, 30 pages? Not even that.
And maybe 17, 18.
17
Yeah.
pages.
Yeah.
So that's close to 20 or 30.
Yeah.
So there'll be a 17-page item versus a 400-page item. So we will stipulate that you have all read the outreach and the comments, and so we'll have one tight document to bring back. We'll put it on regular business, so we have one final opportunity to walk you through it, and then hopefully get your approval and move forward with this very big project.
Huzzah.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you, Thomas. Appreciate your time on all of that.
I do actually have just a final
Yeah, go
fun
for it.
run of, I do have a little bit more presentation. Very timely. Downtown Redmond Station is opening May 10th, and I've created for you a self-guided tour if you are interested. This is very optional, but just so you know, there will be 10 stations that will be accessible from South Bellevue Station all the way to downtown Redmond. If you're interested, I have provided some questions for you to think about as you take this ride. It doesn't have to be on May 10th, but that is an opening ceremony, and it'll be a lot of fun, and I will be there. So if you were to go to these stations, considering just how this might apply to Issaquah, things that you like or don't like, I have 3 questions for you to consider. How does the station feel? Does it feel like a destination or just a stop? Is it easy for you to get around without a car or with a car? And who might be benefiting from the station area's development? So very open-ended questions, but these will be particularly interesting for us to be thinking about as we plan our station. Thank you.
Very useful. Thanks, Thomas. Oh, we get to look forward to more and more light rail station openings for years to come. Years to come. Okay, next up we have COM 0106, Utility Rate Study, Introduction and Revenue Requirements, presented by Emily Moon, Public Works Director. We've also got Matt Ellis. I was like, I know you were back there, but you were hidden down there. And Sergey Tarasov, our consultant. And Emily, you have not brought us an easy topic to end the night. I feel like this is just a lighthearted walk in the park, right? Okay.
Good evening, City Council. I am Emily Moon. I'm the Public Works Director. And I am joined by Matt Ellis from my department and Sergey Tarasov, who is from our consulting partner, who is helping to do our modeling and provide us with all sorts of wisdom on best practices. This is a big topic. We only undertake this work every few years, so it is important for us to go about it in a thoughtful way. It also provides us the opportunity to true up numbers. So we have lived a few more years, we have different idea of what our capital needs are, different understanding of our operating needs, and so on. And so it's important for us to refresh where we are with the utility funds. So tonight, I'm just going to give a quick introduction of the study and then turn it over to Sergey so that he can walk you through more components of it. Our hope is that we can share where we're headed on assessing the revenue requirements for each fund and provide an opportunity to receive some of your feedback. Tonight, there are two specific things we're hoping to get from you. One is to just confirm the way in which you would like us to continue the dialogue around the utility rate study. There are multiple components. We foresee future meetings. Our plan, as proposed, would be to take the bulk of it to the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee. Second piece is we are hopeful that you can help confirm tonight your preference on the rate scenarios. We've given you a few options on each of the utility funds. Of course, there are countless scenarios that we could have presented to you. We certainly have played with many for each of the utility funds, but we think these illustrate the big choices. And so we're hoping to get your feedback on those. In doing so, as we present them, we'll be talking about these things that are in the gray font. So capital investment and reserves, debt, how the cash flow for each fund is affected over time, and then our achievement of various financial management practices and policies. So this is our overall goal. This is the goal that was expressed in our RFQ. It's a very common goal for a utility rate study, and it's simply to develop new rates for our funds that provide for operational and capital needs over the next 5-year period, but we look longer term so that we have an eye toward the future. That's our big picture goal. Fine-tuning just a little bit more, we have these objectives. Again, these were reflected in the RFP. There are common objectives for utility rate study. These are also found throughout various utility fund plans, system plans that we have. And so our goal is to ensure that our future rates will be predictable, smooth, and uniform, establish a defensible basis for assigning the cost shares and providing equity for ratepayers, cover the full cost of providing utility services now and in the future, provide sufficient operating reserves to protect the solvency of the funds, and afford the investment in capital infrastructure to ensure current and future customers pay their share of the system's costs. This is the timeline that we are proposing. This is our best laid plan. And as you see, we're hoping after this meeting to take cost of service analysis, deep dive, the rate design, and the general facility charges discussion to the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee, hopefully returning with a full package that would be that draft study with all the recommendations, and then returning to the full City Council for review and adoption at the end of the summer. I want to touch on just a couple of assumptions or inputs that we have on the study before I turn it over to Sergey. These are inputs that we had to reflect on a little bit and make sure that we were providing some guidance to the consultants on this. The first is staffing. So I wanted to be clear about what we have modeled in each of the scenarios. These are the FTE additions that are in the background on each of those scenarios. You can see I've added some data just to back up some of the rationale for why we have proposed these positions into the future, but I wanted to clarify, of these 11.75 FTE, 5 of these positions were included in the adopted 25-26 biennial budget. So it's the remaining 6.75 that are in the model and certainly would be pending future budget deliberations by the City Council. But for the purpose of planning for the future, we want to make sure that we had modeled the additional staffing needs. The second piece I wanted to just mention before I turn it over is we have given you a scenario number 3, for the Stormwater Fund, where we have reduced the modeled capital program, both by modifying timing or scope or funding source, non-rate revenue of some of the nearer-term CIP projects, and also by capping the assumption for capital expenditures beyond 2030 to a level that's consistent with more of our recent historical spending. That's the background on those 2 assumptions that I know Sergey wasn't going to talk to in depth, but he has a lot more. So I'm going to turn it over to him now.
Well, good evening, Council, and thank you for taking the time this evening to meet with me to talk about utility rates for the water, sewer, and stormwater utility. As Emily mentioned, my name is Sergey Tarasov with FCS, and virtually I actually have with me joining Paul Quinn, who's been leading the technical portion of the study. So in case we get into any specific questions, he'll be able to pop in if necessary to answer a little bit more details, since I don't have the backup with me. Now, as I present, sometimes I get really excited about rates and I start talking really quickly. So do let me know if I'm just going too fast, and I'll definitely slow down. Now, before we dive into the presentation itself, just wanted to provide you with a brief background. We're going to start out with a quick refresher of the findings of the prior study, which was completed in 2020. Then we'll move on to the big picture, kind of methodology behind utility rate setting, just providing you with a little bit of education in terms of what actually goes into these type of studies, what are the steps included, and then we'll dive into going over the key assumptions that went into the analysis, the key components of the study, and then we'll go over the preliminary results, focusing on that first step of the rate study process, and we'll go over all the steps kind of conceptually speaking in a couple of slides. At any time, if you have any questions, please do let me know, and we can pause and answer anything you have. So just a quick refresher here. The last study was completed in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. So there was quite a few issues that the city was trying to address, as other communities have during that time. The result of the study brought forth a 4-year implementation rate strategy. I believe the initial year, 2021, no increases were implemented. So the rate strategy at that time started in 22 and went through 2025. So technically a 4-year implementation plan. Now the study at that time also forecasted costs beyond the 5-year period, or the no increases plus 4-year period. But the city likes to revisit things as a good practice before moving too far out into the future when you're adopting actual rate increases. And that's why we're here today. We're right at that point in time where the prior plan has expired, and before any new adjustments are implemented, we want to recalibrate. We want to make sure everything still makes sense and take a look if we need to deviate or we can stay the course. Now, before getting into the specifics, just a brief outline of the overall rate study process. On here, you'll see the methodology utilized in typical rate setting when performing a comprehensive rate study. Now, typically, a comprehensive study such as this one that we're performing for the water and sewer utilities primarily, as well as stormwater utility, consists of 3 key analytical steps. They have to be performed sequentially, and we usually start with the revenue requirement, where we define the overall needs of each utility independently. We usually like to say that each utility needs to be assessed individually to make sure that everybody paying for their costs. If there's customers that only use one service, we want to make sure they're not paying through inter-utility subsidization for a different service. Once we identify the overall revenue needs from a big picture perspective, we move on to allocating those costs to different customer classes and trying to answer the question if cost differences exist to provide service to different customer types. So residential customers versus multifamily customers versus commercial customers, and so on. Usually I like to use an analogy of kind of identifying the size of the pie of expenses in step one and splitting those pie, that pie into pieces in step two. Lastly, once we have identified the overall dollar targets in the first two steps, we develop the actual fixed and variable charges that we assess to our customers. And there's different policy objectives that we incorporate throughout the process. So this is just a high-level overview of what actually has to happen sequentially before we come back to you with the final recommendation, the final fixed charges, the final volume and variable charges. So today our emphasis will be on that first step. So we'll take a slide or so introducing the topic, and then we'll get into the assumptions behind the analysis. As I mentioned in the introductory slide, at the very basic level, a revenue requirement is a comparison of your rates today to your ongoing obligations. The big question here is, can we meet our costs at current rates? And if not, what do we do about it? The emphasis here, as you can see on the slide as well, is that we really strongly emphasize that each utility needs to be self-sufficient. One utility, like the water utility, is not subsidizing the sewer, or vice versa. A couple of items to keep in mind when developing the revenue requirement. Number one, we want to make sure we cover all costs, your direct costs such as operating costs, debt service, capital, any of those expenses, but also your indirect costs, meaning that we have appropriate financial policies incorporated. We've established the financial impact of those policies, and we have modeled them appropriately in the multi-year forecasting process to make sure that utilities are not just sustainable today, but also are sustainable in the future. We're prepared for any disruptions in the economy, in the climate, and it's just a great guide to make sure we're operating within specific goals and parameters. And lastly, as the city has done a great job of, looking at things from a multi-year perspective is fairly important in our opinion, not just focusing on the test year, but giving yourselves alternatives. If things are coming up, like we know King County or Cascade Water Alliance, who provide the city with wholesale water services or sewer treatment services, they have published their preliminary increases. We know we have a robust capital plan. Planning for those things, looking out in the future, just gives you more alternatives how to address those issues. If we just focus on our narrowed window of today, we might come to a point in time in 3 years where we're forced to do a double-digit increase or even higher if we're not being prepared to address it today. Now, in terms of some of the key assumptions that went into this study development and this update. The rate setting period that we'll be focusing on will be the next 5 years or so, 2026 through 2030, because we want to make sure we don't fall off the cliff, so to speak. We did project our revenue requirements through 2043. So close to a 20-year projection. We started about it last year, so we are looking about 20 years out or so in our expenditure and revenue projections. To forecast revenues, we are utilizing the 2023 billing statistics that were available for forecasting and applying a growth rate. The reason why we went with the 23 number is that when we looked at the last 3 years of consumption information, the primary utility that really benefits from normalizing data and weather normalization is the water utility, because there is volatility from summer usage and peak usage time periods. When we looked at the data, there has been a small trend of decline in residential consumption and increase in commercial consumption, which is consistent with kind of the trends we saw back during the pandemic, when a lot of folks stayed home, work from home, usages went up quite a bit. At the residential side, we saw a trend of that decline over the last 3 years or so from a consumption perspective based on the data we evaluated, plus all the other work that we perform within the region. So we felt like the 23 year that we had available was the latest year, but also was the most representative year of the more normal, so to speak, hopefully more normal conditions and usage patterns that the city will experience. So we didn't feel like 21, 22 data was as most representative of kind of the new normal, so to speak. Now, in terms of the growth rates, we are assuming a little bit more of a conservative rate of growth from a revenue and connection charge perspective. In order to arrive at this rate, we kind of did a combination of internal discussions plus a review of historical general facility charge revenue, which represents kind of one-time revenue from new construction. And we saw, especially in the last couple of years, the growth rates, especially for sewer and stormwater utility, have been hovering around that 0.25%, maybe a tiny bit higher for the water utility, but we really have seen a drop-off for many communities in the last 6 months, especially with a little bit of uncertainty that's happening in the economy right now. We wanted to be just a little bit mindful from a rate-setting perspective and be conservative from a growth side. So that's why we're using 0.25% there. Based on the timing of the study, we are utilizing the 24 budget, but we did review it in quite a bit of detail with your staff. We had several meetings reviewing pretty much every line item, making sure we're including and incorporating appropriate expenses into our forecast from the budget, but we're also not carrying forward any one-time expenses that were included in the budget. As we'll get into each utility, and as Emily has presented, we are also adding to our forecast any FTE additions that did not make it into the 24 budget. So the city has approved several positions already in 25-26 budget. We tried to incorporate it and add it to the 2024 forecast, as well as looking beyond the first year, the second year, just based on the staffing needs that the city currently has for the utilities. We would try to capture it with a discussion with your staff, and that's why we're also going to be looking at several FTE additions beyond what was already approved in the 25-26 time cycle. Now, because we are forecasting 20 years into the future, we had to make several escalation assumptions, kind of using the more recent historical indices, plus also kind of a general sense of what we are seeing everywhere else. We are anticipating approximately 4% general cost inflation, specifically for general costs, materials, supplies, labor, and then 5% for benefits, kind of a weighted benefits inflation. Again, these are all levers that we can play around with, but they don't have too significant of an impact unless we really go change to 10% inflation versus 4% inflation. That'll have a big impact. But if we're staying 3 to 4%, 5%, there's going to be a reasonable constant kind of an impact from those assumptions. Now, in addition to those general cost inflation metrics, we are also forecasting utility taxes that the city assesses on the utilities, the state excise taxes that are assessed on services for water and sewer, as well as the B&O taxes that are applicable to B&O rate revenue, stormwater utility rate revenues and non-rate revenues. And then the wholesale providers have indicated that they're going to be raising their rates. Cascade Water Alliance has indicated 3.5% to 5% in the next 5 years and potentially higher beyond that. King County just released their updated forecast. They're having to comply with new trade requirements discharging to the Puget Sound, and they're indicating a 7.5% increase in the coming year and then 11.5 and 12.5 per year adjustments, which is fairly consistent to what we're seeing to other utilities who own their own treatment plants. So there's a lot of requirements coming from the regulatory side that are forcing a lot of capital investments for many sewer utilities that are having to provide treatment within our region, but also statewide as well. So the average inflation we're showing is about 5 to 5.5%. If we strictly focus on the weighted average inflation of typical costs like materials and services, labor, that's around 4.25%. Lastly, an assumption that we're going to incorporate based on your feedback, but again, we wanted to start the conversation somewhere, is that if we do utilize bonding and borrowing for our capital program, we typically start the discussion with revenue bond financing because that level of financing is available to all utilities. You have to go through a credit rating approval process. You'll get a rating, and then based on a rating, you would receive a specific interest rate. But in general, most utilities, if not all utilities, have access to revenue bond financing. Low interest loans are a little bit more sparse, and again, they're dependent on what's been appropriated, what's available. Last couple of years, there's been a lot more funding. It's, again, a little bit more uncertain what's coming up in down the road the next couple of years from a low interest financing perspective. So to be, again, a little bit conservative, we're assuming revenue bonds with a 20-year term, which is very common for utility infrastructure financing, 5% interest rate, 1% issuance cost, and the borrowing of the reserve included in the issuance. Lastly, before we switch gears and talk individual policy concepts and then utilities, we'll talk about the financial reserve policies that we have incorporated. The first one is an operating reserve target, which is meant to act as a liquidity cushion for those cyclical fluctuations of revenues coming in at a different pace of expenses coming out. Also for seasonalities, especially for the water utility, if we have an off year, a milder summer than we anticipated or less than average, then we may not generate enough funds to meet our expenses. We want to avoid strictly going to additional rate increases and have enough in reserves to cover those fluctuations. So the current policy for the city is about 90 days of cash operating expenses, which is about $3 to $4 million for water utility in the next 5 years. The sewer utility is about 3.3 to 5.2 million, and stormwater is $2 to $2.5 million. You'll notice they scale over time, and that's because they are tied to the cost of expenses, and as expenses are projected to go up, the reserve should accommodate for that increase and increase as well. The second policy that we're incorporating, it's not an official policy for the utilities, but it's a common policy we recommend. It also goes in hand with our discussions with financial advisors that work with utilities that do go out to the borrowing market. They have indicated that they want to see cash reserves 150 plus days, 250 days, depending on the rating the utility wants to achieve. So every metric, every direction we're hearing is that at least from a crediting rating agency perspective, is that they want to see more cash on hand. But from a practical perspective, we typically recommend to have additional funds available for capital purposes. That could be for cost overruns, minor emergencies, or unanticipated projects. So as an example, if you have the Department of Transportation come in and all of a sudden they tell you we have a project that you weren't planning or aware of next year, it was not in the budget, but we don't want to tear up the street twice because they do some work and then we come in that same area 2 years down the road. We want to piggyback on some of that infrastructure savings. We should have enough cash on hand to be able to do that. If something breaks, we have a main repair or a big asset breaks in a pump station or lift station, we want to have some cash at least to start that repair. Now, a good practice is to have 1 to 2% of plant and service or look at a specific asset infrastructure estimate, what would happen if this goes out and how much money we would have to start the repair. So for the water utility, we're using about 2% of plant and service, which is about $2 million to $3 million that we need to have on hand. And again, once we have this amount of money, we don't need to keep funding it. Once it's available, typically that is sufficient and we don't need to continue having our rates set aside additional reserves. For the sewer utility, we looked at an emergency project such as a lift station or a collection main going out, which was about $1 million estimate. And for the stormwater utility, it was a culvert project, which was about $2 million, which was pretty close to 2% of plant and service as well. So that kind of fell in line equally. Now, from a practical perspective, these are metrics that we want to monitor for the rate setting purposes. In reality purposes, operational purposes, these reserves don't really need to be separated. They can be combined as long as they can meet a combined target. So we personally like to model it and track it separately because that just helps us make sure we can meet this target and that target. But from a practical operational perspective, you don't have to do that from that perspective as long as there's a reasonable and rational logic behind the sizing and then the need for those reserves. The last policy we have incorporated is related to debt borrowing itself. It's a debt service coverage requirement and typically comes with specific loans such as revenue bonds. They come with a ratio calculation which basically need us to meet a certain debt obligation to provide a surety to our debt holders that we can make the payment. Now let's get into the discussion of policy perspectives in terms of the funding alternatives and decisions we're going to need to have some input from you. The first one is regarding funding our capital. Typically there's 3 ways to fund our capital. One is 100% cash financing. Usually they'll come with a higher front end pressure on our rates. The second alternative is kind of the opposite, debt financing. If you really rely on debt in the short term, especially if you don't have a lot of debt, you're going to potentially smooth out your rates, but in the long term it'll cost you more. There's a couple of benefits. You can enhance intergenerational equity, meaning that some of their projects are there to bring growth online, and by funding it through debt, you're allowing more customers to come in and join the repayment of those assets, and then you're aligning up the cost of the project with the repayment of the project and the duration of the project. Lastly, a hybrid approach might look at funding renewal and replacement, the assets that are being used through rates, and then funding capacity enhancing projects through debt. So, as Emily mentioned, there's going to be a couple of key policy considerations that we would like you to have in your back of your mind as we're going to be discussing specific scenarios for each utility. The first one will be regarding the financing strategy. Do we use cash? Do we want to avoid debt? Some utilities have done that. Do we want to use debt, maximize the debt to try to mitigate the front-end increases that we might be seeing? That could be an alternative. The next policy will be regarding multi-year rate setting. Now, a couple of your utilities have projects that require long-term planning, like the water utility, which has a treatment plan in it that has been discussed in prior studies, that has been discussed by councils and prior councils as well. So we do have to take a longer look. Other utilities don't necessarily have a dedicated project schedule, and you might want to choose to look only at a 5-year plan. If you do that, based on our current forecasting, you might be forced to do higher increases in the next rate study, 5 years down the road for the next 10th year plan. So the big question will be, do we only plan for today and potentially have higher increases tomorrow, or do we want to have slightly higher increases today to keep the increases as smooth as possible? And lastly, as Emily mentioned, on the stormwater side, do we try to fund all projects we need to fund, or only focus on the critical projects? And we'll show you what that means as we get into the utility specifically. So now we'll switch gears and we'll talk about each one of the utilities
We've got a
individually.
question before we move on. Councilmember Martz?
Sure. A ways back, you said something about, what's the regional utility that's planning on 11% annualized expense increases?
King County treatment? King County?
King County what?
Treatment.
Oh, the treatment.
Yes.
Water treatment.
And it's usually treated as a pass-through cost for many communities. You don't really have a lot of control over the treatment costs that they provide you.
And that's going to be 11% annualized for how long?
I believe, based on my recollection, there's 2 years of 11.5 and then several years of 12. So I'm just going by memory. Paul, please correct me if I'm off significantly, but from the recent forecast, again, it hasn't been adopted, but the recent forecast has increased it quite a bit in the short term.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember DiMichele.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. First, I think I know the answer to this, but I think this probably fits into this discussion right now. What do we offer to our low-income residents in terms of relief from utilities? Could I just get a little overview of that? And when we talk about low income, is that 30% or below AMI, or what qualifies as low income in our community?
And I just looked it up recently. I believe currently there's a low-income senior program that provides a 75% discount to water and sewer bills, as well as solid waste, which we're not talking about today, and then fully, I believe, pays for the stormwater rate. I'm not quite sure about the criteria for the definition. Oh, PSC, Puget Sound Energy, has their definitions.
Oh, we follow that. Okay. And then my other question is, we're looking at key policy considerations, and we have these options in front of us. Have we done an analysis of places where we could save money as part of, I see nodding heads. Okay. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Have we already factored in places where we can reduce expenses into this analysis? Thanks.
Yes, we are always looking for opportunities. We typically spend more time on that during budget development time. This exercise is about having a healthy dose of conservatism over costs, as we were just discussing, that we cannot control. So there are opportunities, of course, on the operating side. There are opportunities on the capital side. We will be discussing with you tonight, in particular, the opportunities on the capital side for the Stormwater Fund, where we could choose to be more ambitious or aggressive or slightly less. But we do look at opportunities to save where we think it's reasonable. These funds are also heavily governed by our regulatory requirements. And so we may have less ability to do that in places where we need to meet those required mandates.
Councilmember Hall?
Let me ask just one question about borrowing before we move on then. So the feds, are playing with this idea of doing away with tax-exempt municipal bonds. Is that something we need to be mindful of or concerned about if we decide to go down the debt financing pathway?
We'll have to definitely monitor it, but again, it's very early in the process.
Okay, we're ready for the next.
Great. And feel free to keep asking any questions you might have. So we'll start our discussion, utility-specific discussion with the water utility. And in this slide, you'll see the key components that went into the definitions of the revenue requirement. Here you'll see a table in the upper left that shows you a summary of revenues and expenses that are included. We're showing you ranges just to try to avoid to show kind of inundating you with numbers. So I'll try to walk you through the table and it'll be consistent between utilities. On the revenue side, at current levels, we're projecting about $16.4 to $16.6 million in revenues under current rates, which includes utility tax pass-throughs to the general fund and non-rate revenues, but predominantly is made up of rate-type fees and charges. Our operating and maintenance expenses are approximately $10 million, getting up to about 12.7, utilizing the various forecasting assumptions that, and escalation assumptions that we discussed a couple of slides ago. Our water purchases coming from Cascade are about 2.5 to 3.2 million in this time horizon. And we do currently have some existing loans through Drinking Water State Revolving Fund program of about 300,000 per year, which go out to about 2041. So there is an obligation on hand, and it is still outstanding outside of the preliminary 5-year period. Now, in terms of the capital plan, we have identified approximately $44 million of projects that need to be completed in the 5-year study. And these projects are, the $44 million are represented in inflated dollars. In terms of the funding for these projects, we're anticipating the first to use reserves and rate funding, next to use general facility charges. Again, general facility charges are one-time fees imposed on new development. They're not ongoing rates. So whenever somebody connects to your system, they have to pay that fee. And we will be updating these fees as part of the study. Any grants or contributions in aid of construction are deducted from our capital plan. And then lastly, the last kind of measure of funding that we look at is debt financing, which will vary based on the scenario we present to you. Now, outside of the 5-year plan, we're also seeing a need for another $100 million of projects in the next 15 years. So again, about $40 million in the first 5 years, adding inflation to the additional capital needs adds another $100 million in the following 15 years or so. And all these years do include the treatment plant, which is estimated at about $22.3 million through 2037 with various timing and adjustments in the capital plan. As we previously mentioned, we are including the 4.3 FTEs for various positions between 2026 and 2030. So putting everything together, on this slide you'll see the summary of the revenue requirement. Here the bars represent expenses, and the line, the solid black line, shows you revenues under current rates. The bars are made up of a solid blue portion, which is operating and maintenance expenses, the orange portion, which is the purchases of water from Cascade, a small sliver with a green, which is debt service, and then the yellow is the net capital, net of contributions and net of general facility charges. When we compare it to revenues under current rates, we can see that our rates today can cover our operations and a small amount of capital, but not the entire capital plan. So what we're finding is right now we can meet our baseline needs of O&M, but all the regulatory requirements, the treatment plant upgrades, and all the additional projects were not quite there when we're looking at those projections. Now, on the second slide here of the results, we wanted to also bring in the fund balances because the city has accumulated some reserves. And what we're looking at here is the shaded area represents your current reserve projections, assuming nothing's done. So this is a baseline scenario, and compares it to the combined balance target over the 5-year horizon, represented with a solid black line. As you can see, we currently are meeting and exceeding our minimum targets, but if we do nothing with our rates and continue on with the capital plan that was identified, we would go below target by about 2028 and then fully deplete our balances by 2029. So in summary, again, in the short term, we're able to meet our operations. If we go a little beyond our short-term 5-year period, if we really go beyond that time period without doing rates, we would start to default on our debt service next, outside of that 5-year range, and then operations. Our capital really is the short-term driver. So the 3 scenarios that we presented, or one to present to you, all kind of center around how do we fund that capital plan. The first scenario looks at funding the 20-year plan with cash only. The second scenario really focuses on maximizing the debt. And then the last scenario tries to put a hybrid alternative somewhere in the middle. You notice we will not provide you at this time a short-term scenario of 5 years only because we do have to fund the treatment plant, and we did receive a lot of guidance that we have to do that project. And since it scales outside of the 5-year plan, we're not looking at that option. But Emily did note there are other scenarios that we looked at. There's a lot of scenarios, infinite amount of scenarios, so to speak, that we can run. So these are kind of the bookend options that we wanted to show you, kind of the high end, the low end, and maybe somewhere in the middle. But we can definitely generate potentially other alternatives based on discussion today.
Before we go on, we've
Yep.
got a question from Councilmember Hall.
Can you repeat what you just said around the new treatment plant? Because one of my questions was going to be, do we really have to factor this into our rate scenarios? So what did you just say about the water treatment plant in particular?
Since the treatment plant starts within the 5-year plan, and we can't just start and stop it, and it goes outside of the 5-year plan, we are looking at a scenario of funding the entire 20-year plan. You'll notice one of the policy questions is, do we only focus on 5 years, which we'll have for the next utility, I believe. But for the water utility, because once we start on the treatment plant, we kind of have to address it and finish it. So we did not generate that scenario only for this one.
Okay, I think I'm at least following the logic of what you said there. Okay, and we'll have a discussion about it.
Okay, and do let me know if you want to clarify that somewhere. So as we get into the results, on slide 24, you'll see a table summarizing each scenario, and I'll briefly describe it, and then we can evaluate what it's telling us. Each scenario will have the annual increase. These are annual numbers that would be in effect each year, depending on your preference. Next, we show the average residential bill using about 1,200 cubic feet or 12 CCF of monthly consumption. This was based on historical statistics that we saw for a typical user on an annual basis. So since you bill bi-monthly, we're showing the bill bi-monthly, but sometimes it's easier to think about it on a monthly basis, so we can simply divide it by 2, and that would mean 6 CCF is used, or 600 cubic feet is used on a monthly basis. Currently, your customers using that much are paying about $108.76. And different scenarios will layer different levels of an impact to that average bill. The last piece for each scenario that we're showing is the amount of debt that is assumed within the 5 years, and you'll notice a column to the right showing you kind of a sum total for that rest of the duration, the other 15 years. So let's quickly go through each scenario, starting with the cash funding only. If we're going to try to fund everything through cash for the entire 20-year duration, we would be looking at about 6.75% increases on an annual basis, which is still slightly below the prior forecast. If you may look at the slide 2, I believe, or 3 in the presentation, the anticipated increases were slightly higher for the first 2 years. What that would mean for a typical customer is a $7.34 increase in 2026. If you put it in the monthly terms, it would be slightly over $3.60 on a per month basis for 2026 only. Scenario 2 looks at maximizing debt. That means for your about $149 million program over the 20-year horizon, you would be borrowing close to half of it. $70 million would need to be financed to bring down the increases to about 4.75%. That would present an impact of about $5.17 in 2026 for a 2-month period. If we look at it on a monthly terms, it's about $2.55 or so. Lastly, the hybrid scenario is somewhere in the middle. It tries to reduce the amount of debt that you're borrowing closer to 20% or so of the capital plan at $29 million in the back end and another 1.4 in the front end. The increases would be somewhere in the middle at about 5.5%.
Got a question? Councilmember Ray?
Great, thank you. How much, you mentioned that we currently have outstanding debt. How much do we currently have? You know?
I would have to go and double check. We have about $300,000, both principal and interest, over the next 16 years.
How much, you know what the principal is, the outstanding principal?
Not going off the top of my head, but Paul, if you do know that, please do let us know.
Yeah, so we have about $1.9 million of debt outstanding at this moment.
So kind of chump change relative to the numbers we're talking about.
That's correct.
Okay. And then for your calculation purposes, what kind of an interest rate were you assuming? And it was, I'm thinking, was a 20-year term?
20-year term, 5% interest rate, 1% issuance cost.
Okay, great, thanks.
Councilmember Zhang?
2 questions. First, in the maximized debt funding scenario, what would our debt service coverage ratio be?
So when we do these scenarios, we make sure we comply with all the covenants. I would estimate over 2.0, but not lower than 1.5. Paul, please do correct me if I'm wrong.
You give me a moment here, I gotta load it.
For all the options, we do make sure that we comply with our coverage.
Okay.
But Paul will let us know the lowest number we forecast.
Okay. And then on option 1, cash funding the 20-year CIP, does that mean that we're going to get all, raise all the cash needed to fund the 20-year CIP within this 5-year period? Or would that,
It's smooth, it creates a smooth trajectory based on the forecasted costs we have. So it's not going to raise all the needs, but gradually over time, it creates a scenario where you have enough cash throughout the forecast, looking at some of the peak years in the future that are causing us to have a deficiency. So it's not necessarily we just build up a big war chest today and just stop and do nothing. It keeps 6 3/4 over time, so we're gradually depleting the reserve, but also slightly increasing it at the same time. So a general reduction of reserves, trying to keep it above target levels that we have demonstrated, but some years a little higher, some years a little lower.
So as a follow-up question, so that assumes that we're going to also, continue increasing rates past 2030,
That's
as
correct.
shown in the slide. And then with scenarios 2 and 3, would the debt financing also, how would that look past the end of this forecast period?
So starting in 29, we anticipate every 2 years or so a new debt issuance with this plan. So by keeping the rates as low as possible, that was the intent of scenario 2, trying to keep them as minimal as possible with all the parameters that we have identified. We realistically recognize that the city would not go to the market annually because of the cost of financing. So typically, at the very bare minimum, it's 2 to 3 years. So we anticipated every 2 years, I think, for a new issuance for this strategy. Again, it's a starting discussion point, and we can definitely modify those assumptions as well. Okay.
And just as a follow-up, so in that max debt scenario, the lowest point for debt coverage would occur or is projected to occur in 2041, and that would be a 1.27 times.
So in that case, the pretty far out there, the debt service we anticipate would be the driver of the pressure, and we would keep the rates over time as smooth as possible, with 2041 being kind of the choke point of the strategy. Obviously, 2041 is far out there. A lot of things can change, but for modeling and discussion purposes, we have to go around the parameters that we have.
Thanks.
Okay. Next, we'll move on to the sewer utility. It's going to be very similar, so hopefully this will go a little faster for everyone. The rates here projected are collecting about $15 to $22 million under current levels. One caveat here with the existing revenues is that we're assuming the King County portion of rates is passed through, and we're only focusing our rate strategy regarding the local portion of the rates. Since we don't have any control over King County, we're only going to be addressing the local share of revenues. So that's why you're seeing an increase in existing revenues, because we are passing those on. O&M expenses from the local side are about $3 million to $4 million within the 5 years. King County, you can see here, isolated is about 10 to 17 million with those levels of inflation that we talked about before. This utility currently does not have any debt service, and the 5-year plan for capital is about 21 million. Now, similar to the water utility, the future rate periods also anticipate another $45 million of projects that would need to be funded, and the mix of funding is very similar to the water utility as we talked about. Now, what does that mean here? The bar will look very similar, but the capital planning needs are not a significant component except for the first year. For the sewer utility, we're able to meet our O&M expenses and keep up with King County because it's a flow-through expense. The capital, we're not just quite keeping up, but we're fairly close on this projection. And the reason, again, why the slope of the line is increasing like that is because we are passing through the King County charges. In terms of reserves, this is where the big question of timing comes on hand. If we only focus on the 5-year plan, our starting point of reserves is meeting our minimum requirements, and if we do nothing with rates altogether, we're going to be drawing them down to the minimum by 29, and even still be above zero by 30, but below the projected minimum coverage or minimum reserve levels. If we take a peek outside of the 5-year period, this is where we start to really hit zero and go negative if we continue on with our path of the capital plan. So this is where it gets a little tricky, because when we talk about scenarios, well, if we just zoom in on tomorrow or today, we're doing great. We might be, we don't need to do anything. As soon as we zoom out 3 years, 4 years, 7 years, then things don't look as great. So from a policy perspective, how zoomed in or zoomed out do we want to get in this case? So for the scenarios for this utility, we have prepared slightly differently. Scenario 1 will only focus in on that 5-year window that we are talking about for setting rates. Scenario 2 will look at the 20-year plan, and both scenario 1 and 2 will be cash driven and cash funded. And lastly, scenario 3 will look at performing the entire 20-year plan, but using as much debt as we can to keep rates as low as possible. So similar tables. The only caveat and difference here on this slide is that we are showing you both the local share, the share that the city has control over in each bill comparison at the top of the bill comparison. Then we're showing you the King County pass-through portion that you don't have control over, and then the total bill. The reason why we wanted to show you both is that this is what your customers will be seeing, but we really are focusing on the local portion of the increases, and the increase that we're showing only applies to the local portion. This does not represent the additional incremental King County increases that are embedded in those rates. So for the cash scenario for the 5-year plan only, just making sure that we can keep up with our reserves, we're projecting close to inflationary level of adjustments of 3.25% per year, which would be about a little under $1.50 for 2026 for a typical residential home on a bi-monthly basis, which is close to 75 cents on a monthly basis for the local share only. Scenario 2, which takes into account the entire 20-year plan, trying to cash fund it, that would bump up from 3.25% now per year to 7%. So instead of $1.50, it's closer to $3.20 bi-monthly, or if you put it in monthly terms, about $1.60 per month more. Lastly, scenario 3, maximum debt alternative would reduce that from 7s to 4.75% per year, but would require $28 million, which is a little under 50% of the capital plan within that 20-year horizon of borrowing. Any questions for the sewer side? Okay. And then we'll finish things off with a stormwater utility. Here again, revenues are projected at $7.5 to $6 million per year before any adjustments, just simply growing with growth. Expenses are $7.8 to $10.1 million. Now notice right here, this kind of is foreshadowing to the next slide, that our O&M expenses are already greater than our rate revenues at current levels. So this doesn't even take into account the capital program of the $31 million. Now the funding for the capital plan is very similar to the other two utilities. So what does that mean when we look at the revenue requirement? Here you can see even starting in year 1 and 25, we're barely breaking even on our O&M expenses. We're actually a little bit in the deficit using reserves already. And as we go into the future and our inflation picks up over time as we add staff to our workforce, we are becoming a little bit more and more deficient every year. So not even bringing in capital, we're not able to meet our obligations. This would draw down our reserves pretty quickly, running out of cash by about 28 if we stay on course without any adjustments. So in terms of scenarios, because this utility is slightly different, again, unlike the first two scenarios where we were able to meet our operating needs and debt service for the water utility in the short term, here we're already starting kind of in the hole on the back foot, so to speak. So for the first scenario we wanted to generate, and this is for illustrative purposes only, this is not a recommended option, we wanted to see what would it cost us just to catch up with operations. So ignoring any level of capital whatsoever, how much of an adjustment we would need to be able to fund our O&M expenses. Second option looks at, okay, let's fund the entire 20-year capital plan. And then the last option, what happens if we defer our non-critical projects outside of the 20-year projections? So there are some projects that are critical, others that we have a little bit more flexibility, and we can potentially look at waiting for, receiving state funding, federal funding, if it ever becomes available, and only then taking and addressing those projects, which is a policy option at your disposal as well. So in terms of summaries, just to keep up with O&M, we estimate you would need about 6.25% just to catch up over the 5-year horizon. This doesn't mean you're going to get there meeting your O&M expenses in year one, this is a smooth option to get us to being cash neutral by 2030, meaning that we're eating into reserves over the time horizon over the 5 years, just to give us a smooth runway to get to self-sufficiency for operations in that 5-year plan. If we layer on the entire capital plan and we avoid debt financing altogether, we anticipate that would be about 16.75% adjustments. Now, the stormwater utility is the smallest from a combined bill perspective out of the three, so a larger percentage will be a smaller dollar bill compared to the total bills for the water and the sewer utilities. And then lastly, the cash funding critical only projects would be about 10%. Now, we ran other scenarios. We looked at debt financing, but because we wanted to focus our attention to about 3 scenarios, otherwise there's just too many options to start a discussion and a conversation. These are the options presented. We also ran a debt scenario, which could drop the scenario 3 to about 7.75% for the next 5 years, followed by 5% thereafter. So there are levers that we can pull with debt, introducing debt into it. But again, we wanted to avoid putting too many numbers on the screen here as well and getting feedback from you. And really, this is the last slide that we have on the next one. A typical comparison. Oh, it looks like a little shader moved a little bit here. Here we have the comparison of a typical residential bill, what it costs a customer on a bi-monthly basis to receive water, sewer, and stormwater services in the city of Snoqualmie, which is highlighted with a shaded area, versus other neighboring utilities for same level of usage. Now, I always want to caution that this is a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison. Every utility is different. The topography is different. The level of service they receive is different. Some utilities have their own treatment plants. Other utilities procure full service, treatment, or supply. So there's just a lot of volatility. In addition to that, some utilities also defer maintenance, trying to keep the rates as low as possible, while others try to be proactive as well. So I caution to everybody, apples and oranges comparison, but it's a very common question that gets asked by everybody, including the community members. So we wanted to share that information with you today as well. So a typical bill currently pays in the city about $312 bi-monthly. Comparing your neighboring utilities, that is on the lower end. And I know for a fact that quite a few of these utilities are going through their own rate studies. Several utilities will be passing rate adjustments in the coming months as well for 26 if they haven't done so already. So other utilities are going through very similar discussions as you are as well. And with that, any additional questions?
Before I go on, let me just check in with Councilmember Joe and see if there are any questions on the utility rate study. I'm happy to come back to you, but I just want to make sure to always check in with the phone.
No, thank you. Appreciate that. I had a question about our debt financing and whether or not the debt that we put out there is a tax-free debt or they are taxable bonds, and if the ability to have them non-taxable goes away from the federal administration, how that might impact our overall financing if it's a factor. Thank you.
I believe the current debt is very limited. It's through a drinking state revolving fund loan, which I believe is tax-free loan. If the tax-free bonding availability goes away, again, we'll have to take a look at that. Most likely it's going to be a more costly investment, a higher interest rate. So we could model a slightly higher cost of borrowing as well into these scenarios, which would add a little bit of pressure. We're being hopefully a little conservative with 5%, but again, the several utilities that I've talked to that issued, depending on their rating, have been in the 4s recently. More recently, it's very hard to forecast what the interest rates are going to be in the next couple of years. They've been really low 3-4 years ago at 3.25%, but they've also been very high in the past as well. So this is, again, using a conservative rate, hopefully, but there's a lot of things up in the air that could change pretty quickly, too.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Joe. I'll make sure to come back to you for feedback. I'm going to go to everybody else for questions, starting with Deputy Council President DeMichelle.
And I believe we have a couple final slides. So if we could perhaps just finish up the presentation. Okay.
Well, we're asking questions right now. So,
That's fine.
yeah, we will definitely go to the direction slides at that point. But any questions?
In the packet, I think there was a statement about if we did debt financing, that would defer rate increases. At some point, there would be sort of a drop-off where rate increases would really increase significantly. Is that at the end of the 20 years projected, or what are we talking about in terms of deferring increases? So that, I'm thinking about the smoothness of this. Can you just get into that a little bit, how that works?
So typically, as we kind of went as an example, we'll go back to a utility that has a debt option. So in this case, cash financing, the full plan is 7%. The max debt scenarios are 4.75%. Being in a vacuum, the percents will be in effect for a longer period of time outside of the 20-year period. So the cumulative increase would incrementally get larger over time because we have to cover the interest. But in the short term, especially because the city doesn't have a lot of debt today, or any debt for the sewer utility, it would actually help reduce the rate pressure. Now, that ties up your money in terms of debt financing. Once you borrow the money, you have to repay it back, and you can't dictate it or deviate it for any reason, especially if it's bonds, because you do have to meet coverage. For cash financing, unless the project is extremely critical, right, at extreme times, you can defer a project a year or two unless the system is just falling apart. So there are pros and cons with it, and usually the greater cost with the debt scenario comes in a cumulative perspective over years, definitely outside the 5-year period.
Councilmember Hall?
Thank you. A couple questions. First, and if it's better answered with the direction needed slide, feel free to go to that. But the memo made it seem like it was more direction needed was, is this the right sample of scenarios that M&I should look into? And like, are we on the right track? Or is the administration asking which one within each fund would you like to go with?
The latter. We are hoping to get some specific feedback from you about which of the 3 scenarios for each of the funds seems preferable to you. That will enable us to do the next scope of work that we need to do.
Okay, thank you. Okay, then let's go back to the water treatment plant thing then. So there's a lot going on. You talked about Cascade Water too. There's a lot going on there. We've got in the future new tie-ins with Tacoma for Tacoma Wholesale Water. So is the new water treatment center something we have to acknowledge in our rate setting scenario for the water fund, or is that, or can we? I know we've said we'll eventually transition, 2037, to having a new water treatment plant online. Is that something we can revisit for the sake of rate setting?
The short answer is no. We have already put ourselves on a path where we need to begin planning this year. We need to move to land acquisition next year. We have early design that is included in this next 5-year rate study. We're on a path. The window of time that we have to be flexible has closed for the most part. It's possible that some of those phases that I spelled out in the memo could be a little shorter, but some could be longer, depending on trouble acquiring land or permitting or capital construction becoming more difficult for many reasons. Council gave direction a few years ago that we were to pursue this timeline, and so now we're at the point in time we need to take that first step, and therefore, as Sergey has described, we need to start accumulating the funds to pay for each step of the process.
Okay, but do we need to walk this path? I mean, council set the policy to walk this path, like you said, but this council could say we don't necessarily need to have a water treatment plant by 2037 if we're still confident in our ability to purchase cheaper wholesale water from Tacoma or through Cascade. Is that a conversation we can have as part of this so that we don't have to account for? I mean, that's 22 point whatever million dollars for a new treatment plant that we could potentially avoid.
Cascade has no obligation beyond 2037 to provide us with the increment of water that we will need.
Okay, so we can't plan for what we don't have a secure commitment for.
That's
in-
correct.
in purchasing water is what you're saying, and it would be risky to do otherwise.
That's correct.
Okay, I understand.
And Council President, members of the council, if I can just add, we need to be prudent with the facts as we know them. As I think you've heard tonight, there are many facts that can change. And so if the council wishes to have further discussions with Cascade, that's always a possibility. But the fact is, Director Moon said, they have no obligation to provide us water beyond that. So there's a little chicken and egg-ish piece, but there's so much here that could change. But we have to pick a path and we have to go. And so building the plant currently isn't part of that path to move forward. But it can change, and it may change. But we need to be mindful of the path that we're on.
I want to add to the questions on water treatment plant, if anybody's okay with that before moving on. If we, in 2 years, 3 years, got a commitment from Cascade Water in order to be able to purchase water that would enable us to not have to have a water treatment plant or defer it, is that something that we could work into a future scenario by recognizing a reduced cost?
So it's a possibility. I want to be clear about where we are with Cascade. Cascade gives us a base amount of water, and then we have bought under a temporary agreement an increment to cover well 5 while it's out of operation. We still need to provide for that increment of water going forward above the base, plus any growth that is needed. In addition to that, water treatment plant will provide other opportunities for us. Most importantly, the ability to more effectively and efficiently treat for a number of constituents in the water. So there are a bunch of reasons to pursue the water treatment plant. I don't think that's what we're revisiting here. There's a possibility, yes, that we can go back and renegotiate with Cascade. We need to recognize that we're one of their many members. They have other obligations as well to provide future water use to all of those communities. And it's not certain that they would agree. They have done enough of their water planning to understand their future forecast, will allow for them to extend our current agreement, which they have already agreed to do, from 2034 to 2037. But beyond that, they have told us they cannot provide the additional water because of commitments to other communities.
And I'm not trying to argue any of those points. I'm just saying, if we got favorable information, we would use that to reduce future costs.
Certainly, and that's true of every assumption in this study. As we get new information, whether it's good news or bad news, we will refine those assumptions and we will understand how can we respond. Is it through rate reduction? Is it through decreasing the amount of borrowing that we think we need to take on? Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Zhang and then Councilmember Mertz.
Great, thank you. So just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, so the cash funding, the full capital improvement plan, so even, we're projecting like 7% rate increases through this 5-year period, but then, over the next like 10 to 15 years, would the projected rate increases be lower than if we went with the debt financing scenario? And could you provide some detail on what that would look like?
Yeah, I believe the annual increases would be at 7, but again, Paul has the numbers right in front of him. I think the plan goes 7% pretty much through the entire the 20-year horizon. Is that right, Paul?
Yeah, so the 7s go through 2034, and then it would switch to an inflationary type adjustment each year. Whereas the max debt scenario, the 4 3/4 would continue through 2039.
Councilmember Martz?
Thank you. I want to ask, maybe it's the same question, but in a slightly different way. A few years ago, it feels like a few years ago, and somebody's going to tell me it was a decade ago, we did a giant water education and decision-making process here as a body. And we did like, I don't remember how many, but like 4 gigantic committee of the whole type meetings where we talked about our future and like taps and all the various water options and whatnot, and we got really well educated. And so the question is, have things changed such that that decision effectively needs to be revisited? Like, have the fundamentals of our relationship around here on water changed such that we need to have that colossal activity again? Because the amounts of money are staggering, and at the time there were decisions that we were making that in terms of our relationships with the various water providers that were going to be important, like our investments in our own water generation potential versus buying, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my question. Do we need to have that colossal reassessment of our water strategy? Is what you're really saying, have the fundamentals changed since that activity?
And the tricky part, I wasn't involved in the prior discussion, so I'm not sure if you guys have the knowledge. I don't, with many providers around the region, I think Seattle is negotiating with their wholesale customers. Cost of water is not going to be cheaper anywhere else. So it's hard for me to say not being part of those prior discussions and what you have had with Cascade directly. I'm not sure, Emily, if you have.
I guess the short answer is I don't think that those macro assumptions or our worldview on water has changed dramatically. I'm not sure exactly which series of meetings you're talking about, and it could be to what I finally call my Issaquah coma time, where I was not here. But we look at those bigger picture questions every time we do our system plan, and we have recently done that. And so I feel fairly confident that we have a good handle on that big picture, and it has not changed dramatically.
I mean, the big knobs were buying chunks of lake taps and investing in our own pulls from the aquifer.
And for the part that Emily was on her sabbatical for, was when Cascade came to us and said, we have excess capacity. And so we were going down a road that said, we have to build treatment, we needed to build it soon, we have no choice. And then we came and said, well, turns out there's capacity from Cascade. And so that was something that changed that, and that was the last rate study, more or less, when we said, okay, we're going to fold that into the discussion. It puts off the need, it does not eliminate the need for treatment, as you've heard tonight, but it did put that off. And so it's very difficult to make 100% absolute statements about any of this. And so what you're hearing from us is this is our best professional path that we see. And as Director Moon has said, we know we only have a contract to get water from Cascade to a specific date. There is no other provider. We have wells. We need to work that out ourselves. Are there lots of other variables floating around? There absolutely are. Do we want to get into each and every one with you this evening? No, we do not.
No, but my question, and I'm not suggesting we do it all this evening, but my question is, do we want to reopen some of those big questions? Have the fundamentals changed such that that decision that we made, whatever it was, 5 or 6 years ago, should be revisited?
And the answer is no.
Thank you.
I'm going to check back in with Councilmember Joe just to see if you have any questions at this point before we go to probably lack of public comment, but giving that an option. And is Councilmember Joe unmuted from our side? Yeah.
I have no questions at this time. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Just wanted to touch base there. So we had a bunch of questions. Okay, any public members online?
No, we do not.
Okay, and none in the room as well. So if you want to just continue those last few slides so that we get the direction needed, and then we will give it to you.
Absolutely. So as we said at the beginning, what we're seeking tonight is to first confirm that you are okay with taking the next round of in-depth dives into the rate study to the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee, and then having the committee refer those recommendations and the proposed plan back to the full council. So that's question one. And then question two, again, knowing these are ballpark scenarios meant to illustrate possible choices, we are seeking some feedback from you as to your preferred scenario for each of the various funds.
Great, so I'm going to suggest we keep that slide up so that we can all refer to it. Oh, you guys raised things, okay, I was going to say, because I was looking the other way. Councilmember Martz.
So I'm going to do that thing that is probably annoying at times, but I'm going to put on the little 16-year hat because this kind of conversation has come up over and over and over again over the last 16 years. And I think that one way to look at it, and the way that I personally like to think about it, is, is there an annualized rate increase level that we consider too much, right? Is there do we as a council want to say, and historically we have said something like 5 or 6% per year is beyond that is not territory that we generally want to go into if we can avoid. So I personally would look at this, and let's say you use a 6% bogey, what would it take in each of these to hold at 6%, right? For water, it means you don't want to use cash fund, right? But you could get away with the hybrid funding. With sewer, it means a different thing, and with stormwater, you just would have to go with that first option, and it's smaller dollar involved amounts, but the percentage increases are just eye-watering. So again, that's just one way to do it, but it is a way that we've talked about historically, is saying we don't want to be in the business of passing more than 5 or 6% on annually to our folks if we can avoid it, because that really becomes very difficult for a lot of folks, even though, like I said, stormwater isn't huge amounts of dollars. So that would be the strategy that I would suggest. Thank you.
Councilmember Hall.
Well, first of all, thank you for clearly the very detailed hard work that staff and consultants have been living and breathing in this work. So I appreciate that, and you're seen in that, so thank you. I'm also very bummed that I'm not on the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee anymore, because this just sounds really fun. But yes, okay with in-depth dives going to M&I. We have very distinguished members of our council there, so I trust them to make good recommendations back to us, and of course, we'll follow along. I think my initial feedback is very similar to Councilmember Martz. I'm really highly sensitive to cost of living right now. I have a feeling it's going to show up as one of the #1 issues again in our community survey this year. And so I think it makes sense to try to come up with the balanced approach for each of these rate scenarios. So I think that's scenario 3 for all of them. Is that right? So I think that's kind of the biggest thing on my mind is, yes, we have a lot of needs, but we also have to understand that cost of living is on everyone's mind. And so that's kind of my initial thoughts on that. I also don't know if we might have already done this before in the past, but I think we should share our story around the sewer fund with King County. We're all just trying to meet needs, but the increase at the county level, we should be able to share a story with them that it is forcing us to have to cut back on not meeting some of the needs that show up in our community. And here's how, so on and so forth. So I'm disappointed, but again, understand that everyone's trying to meet needs. And thank you for kind of taking a minute to walk us through the water treatment center thing. Now that we've walked through that a little bit, the logic of why we need to keep walking down the path right now makes much more sense to me. So thank you. I'm just, always trying to think of, we were all so excited because we're like, oh, a cheaper path, right, for wholesale water. But anyways, I appreciate your thoughts on that, and then keeping an eye on whatever happens in this tax exempt municipal bond space will be interesting as well. Thanks again for all the work. Those are my initial thoughts.
Deputy Council President DiMichele.
Thank you. So these are tough decisions to look at. So I agree with Councilmember Hall that people are really, really sensitive to rate increases and tax increases right now. And I am looking at this kind of through the lens of a senior citizen who's on a fixed income, as many of our senior citizens are. However, I also asked the question earlier because I know that people who are low income and on fixed incomes and so forth also really cannot handle large, sudden increases. And so I am really looking at what's going to be the smoothest path. If we have to increase, how can we do that in a gradual way over time? And if we, for example, set a cap of 6% or whatever, all we're doing is kicking it down the road where we would have to have higher increases later on, which would benefit me possibly. But thinking about people in general, it's a really hard thing to all of a sudden get a big increase. And so I'm much preferring the idea of if we have to do increases, let's do them slowly and gradually. So for underwater, I had marked that the hybrid funding appealed, or it seems to me the best way to handle that. Under the sewer, you'll notice that I'm not going for the debt. Under the sewer one, scenario 2, and then under the stormwater, scenario 3. I think we're just going to have to look at cutting some of those projects. And I know Councilmember Jang asked for a list of the projects that might be cut, and I can't find that email, but that was a really good list. And so if you could send that to us before the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee meets on this topic, I would really appreciate that. So I think we have to know exactly what we would end up cutting if we have to do that last scenario. So those are preliminary, first cut looks. And as a member of the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee, yes, send that to the M&I Committee. Glad to talk that over. But I'm not feeling really good about going into debt at this particular time. We've got so many other things on the table where we might have to go into debt. I would hate to take that as this is our first step into another round of debt. I'd rather have us try to do it through gradual rate increases and using the cash that we have and not going into debt. So those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Councilmember Zhang?
Yeah, I agree a lot with what Deputy Council President DiMichele said. The debt service coverage ratio of 1.27 means that 80% of our revenue is going to be going towards debt service. That freaks me out. Because what if there's some other, capital expense that pops up in 2040 and we're, already all borrowed out? Are we going to have to raise rates by 20% in 1 year? I'm definitely planning on being around by then. So not hoping to not get hit with, drastic rate increases in the future. So I think definitely, doing the hybrid funding where possible. I think on sewer, there are also, I wonder if there could be a scenario 4, which is more analogous to the hybrid funding scenario 3 for water. That's halfway between, the cash fund and maximizing debt funding. And then similarly on the stormwater, based on my conversation with the Public Works Director earlier today, cutting out some of those non-critical projects doesn't necessarily mean that we're completely not going to do them. It's just that we will only do them if we can get grant funding, and we're not going to rate base those things, which I think makes a lot of sense. For me, I'm like, I would love to do all these because they're environmental projects, but there is also, grant funding for those that potentially doesn't exist for things like moving your stormwater line or whatever the case may be.
Councilmember Ray?
I got to start with a question because I may be unclear, but what's the debt service on, if we want 100% debt, what's the debt service as a percentage of revenue? roughly? I mean, you don't have to get it to the penny.
Are you referring to a specific utility and a specific scenario, or what are you?
No, if we debt funded everything, what would be, and then we took that number of debt service, so let's say it's $100, and then we had revenue of $500, I'd say 20% of our revenue went to debt service. I just want to know what percentage of our revenue, if we did everything with debt, would go to debt service.
Right, so maybe we can provide you a table. I mean, the answer is going to vary pretty significantly depending on what year we're looking at. I mean, it'll be much lower on the front end, but as you add more and more debt, that percentage would increase over time.
Yeah, give me a range.
Can you turn your microphone on?
I'm just trying to get a rough order of magnitude. Is it 50%? Is it 5%? Is it 90%?
So a couple of clarifications for Paul and internally. Paul, why don't you give us a number for the debt scenarios by first year last year? So a large component of the cost will be O&M as well, so it will be a portion of cost. The second clarification I want to make is that none of the maximized debt scenarios are assuming 100% debt financing because of coverage forces you to generate a certain amount of cash
Sure.
eventually. So none of them will be 100% debt financing. So that's just a clarification. So if Paul, if you, whenever you get a chance, if you can let us know those 2 points, it will be 0 in the beginning, probably the high end point. That's where we'll probably see the biggest component in 20 years.
And just so I know what to tell you all, are you looking for a combined for all three utilities, or do you want the answer by utility?
Oh, give me a combined, if you can.
Okay.
If it's easier to give it to me by utility, give it to me by utility.
I can give it to you to combine. Just give me a couple minutes to put those numbers together.
Okay. Well,
Maybe we
while
could get-
while you're doing that, and the reason I'm trying to get at this is, I don't know how much of our revenue we're going to be spending on debt service, which is significant. But my baseline feeling is that we ought to debt fund to the maximum level we can, because that way we are sharing the cost of these enhancements that we're doing with future residents as well as current residents. Whereas if we do everything with kind of a pay-as-you-go, it's the current residents that are paying all of the costs. So, and I am also very sensitive to rate increases, and maximizing our utilization of debt helps with that. And though I appreciate the questions about the federal government making municipal bonds not tax deductible, we would go to the market with the bonds now, and we would lock in the rate now, and so it wouldn't matter to us. Oh, yeah. Why?
Didn't we say that we would be doing borrowing every 2 to 3 years?
Okay, so there would be a curve of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because we do have reserves currently, sorry about that. Because we do have reserves right now, we're trying to balance the strategy, because if we issue debt too early, our rates are not high enough potentially to support it. So we're structuring the issuance only when we're needing them. And that's currently in the back end of the forecast.
Okay. All right. Anyway, just from a directional perspective, I mean, and I think we have lots of really great conversations to have going forward. My bias is towards debt, maximize the debt to within a reasonable limits that make sense to our consultants about how we should do this and what is affordable to us.
Paul, how's it coming?
Another 2 minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
That's
Council
okay.
President, may I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to add one clarification, particularly for council members Martz and Hall. Again, scenario number 1 on stormwater is the only one on this page we are not recommending, because it only solves for our operating deficiency. So it would mean no capital projects, or we'd have to severely cut operating, which would be difficult in stormwater, in order to take on capital projects. So I just wanted to make that clear. It's a problem with the 6%.
I may clarify it for Councilmember Martz. Would the 6% be sufficient if it's 6% for all three combined for an average bill, not limiting each one? So let's say storm could be a little higher, but water could be a little lower. And that way the combined bill is 6% for a typical residential home, as an example?
We're we're getting into the sort of esotericism of the politics. You raise a good point. I'm not. You understand the philosophical point, right? And I said in my comments that stormwater is a much smaller dollar amount than the others. So I fundamentally I think you raise a good point. I'm always. My conversation is always when I go out and talk to people in the community and they want to talk to me about the costs of things, right? I think what you just said would be a good way, could be a good way for me to have that conversation with folks and say, yeah, in individual areas, it's a little bit more, in other areas, a little bit less. But, we're looking as a whole, understanding our impacts to your tax bill. And trying to keep that at a reasonable number. So thank you for that suggestion. It sounds like a reasonable way to think about it.
Thank you.
And
So this is Paul.
go ahead, Paul.
Yep. So just here with some numbers. So I am ignoring stormwater right now since we haven't proposed a scenario that includes debt being issued. So just looking at water and sewer combined. Right now, with the one water issue, total debt service is about 2% of combined water and sewer revenue, rate revenue, that is. If we look out towards 2043, under both of the max debt scenarios, that percentage would climb to about 21% of total rate revenues.
Great, thanks, Paul. Perfect.
Okay, before going to you, I'm just gonna see Councilmember Joe, if you've got any feedback on these scenarios and whether you're comfortable with this going to M&I.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to having this discussion more in depth in the L&I committee. I think that I would agree that for stormwater, S3 is a good idea to keep the critical CIP items grant funded. I know it's difficult, and we're a salmon city. We have to have some base reality in terms of where we are as a city, however. I'm in favor of water hybrid funding 3 at a 5.5% increase, and sewer cash fund 20 years CIP at a 7% increase. I think that the graph that showed where Issaquah is with respect to our peers is very helpful in the conversation, when we're out in our community, and then the general weighted conversation that we're only increasing it by 5% overall is also a good way to think about it. But I'll look forward to seeing what other ideas come forward and look forward again to the discussion at L&I. Thank you.
Okay. Do you have comments then, Councilmember Hall?
Yeah, well, just to clarify, I was not advocating for scenario 1 in stormwater. It's scenario 3. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So looking at my general comments, I agree that our community and the time period is very highly sensitive for rates, and so we need to be very specific on that. However, I'm highly sensitive to the idea of borrowing because it increases the cost overall, and I think that's very important. It also locks us into scenarios in the future, so I would like us to be very careful about selecting that. My preference in general is that we scrub that CIP as hard as possible in all of our scenarios to make sure that we really, really, truly need these in the time periods that we have suggested, and that we cannot delay some of them as ways to reduce costs. So in general, I would say I think you've given me a good reason why we need to fund the 20-year CIP in water. And so in that scenario, I think my concern over debt outweighs the concern over rate increase, and so I would prefer S1. I think in sewer, You've given me a reason that we need to go beyond 2030, but not necessarily a reason that we need to do the full 20-year CIP. And so I think my preference would be somewhere around S 1.5, looking at a 10-year CIP that is cash funded. So hopefully getting a rate somewhere between the 3.25 and the 7%. And then with stormwater, I definitely prefer S3 as funding the 20-year critical items on the CIP only. And so I think just in general, I recognize that stormwater is in the scenario that it is because we maybe didn't have as healthy of a balance in that scenario where we weren't able to fund all of the operating and maintenance expenses, let alone the capital. And so I understand why we need to do that high of a rate increase at this time. And considering it's a smaller portion of people's bill, I'm hoping that we can get closer to that 5.5% to 6% overall, and hopefully limiting the debt as much as possible. That gives us just a lot more flexibility in our future scenarios without tying us into something that says, oh, I'm sorry, community, we cannot fund this water treatment plant that we need 25 years down the road because we're still paying off debt from the last 20 years. And so as much as, yes, those products are being used by future users, those future users also want us to have the flexibility that is needed to do the financing or to select the projects that are needed for each of our utilities in the future. So I think you've heard from everybody, but I think you probably heard lots of different things. So let me have you reflect on that and see if you need more consolidation of thought.
Sure, thank you. I definitely heard a variety of opinions. I did hear some clustering. I heard some commonalities around kind of staying at the, I'll say, midpoint, middle scenario. I heard more people express some willingness to take on some debt than those expressing no desire for debt. So I think we have enough information. Again, this was early moment in time. I think we have enough information to start to play out some additional scenarios as we weave in the next part of the conversation, which really is about cost-sharing allocations between classes of customers. And I think we'll be able to deliver some choices to you that hopefully meet most of these opinions and marks. It was good feedback.
Just reflecting back to council members, do we feel like we provided good information and that staff is going to take it, all of that? Okay. Fantastic. I will return to Councilmember Joe just because you're on the phone, and I want to make sure I give you 100% chance to reflect in if there is anything needed at this time.
No closing remarks. Thank you. Looking forward to hearing this in committee again. Thank you.
Fantastic. I figured that was the case, but since I don't see you visually, I have to make sure to check in. Okay, looking back to our agenda, we've got good of the order. Anybody have anything? Didn't anticipate it. Okay, then we will adjourn at 9:08 p.m. Thank you, everybody.